Hello to everybody. Before we get to the heart of the matter, I would like you to watch a very small video, just 2 minutes, 30 seconds, that we prepared for the first anniversary of the forced disappearance of Santiago Maldonado.
Ya empezó la tierra y la escopeta.
¿Sí? ¿Cómo estuvo el procedimiento?
¿Agitador?
¿Agitador? ¿Ya agitás?
Sí, pobre mapuche desaparecido.
Estamos poniendo todos los esfuerzos para la búsqueda de Santiago Maldonado, como así también muchas personas en la Argentina hoy están extraviadas.
Para intentar dar con el paradero de Santiago Maldonado.
La sangre que se encontró en la cabeza del postero, que había aducido que habría peleado con alguien que él creía que era Maldonado, bueno, negativo.
Ahora, la pregunta es que hay un 20% de posibilidades de que ese chico esté en Chile con el ritmo.
Con un impacto en la zona del glúteo.
Nosotros le damos a la versión, nos da la arquitectura argentina, carácter de verdad. Tanto nosotros como los servicios de España vamos a ayudar en la defensa legal.
Pero la violencia, nosotros no vamos a contestar a su violencia con nuestra violencia.
He decidido iniciar conversaciones con el Fondo Monetario Internacional.
Un debate que nos permita reflexionar sobre el presente y el futuro de las Fuerzas Armadas.
So now I can leave. We are finished. I can leave. Well, thank you very much. On August the 1st, last year, the forced disappearance of Santiago Maldonado, who was a young anarchist who supported the struggle of the Mapuche communities for the recovery of their lands, brought together the words Argentina and desaparecido in headlines all around the world, as we have not seen it for over 30 years. Although it was not the first forced disappearance at the hands of state forces under democratic movements, CORREPI, the organization I belong to, has registered more than 200 forced disappearances since the end of the last dictatorship in December 1983. Santiago's was the first one to take place, as you saw on the video, in the framework of a massive repressive operation which was led by the national government against an indigenous community that was struggling for their lands and to recover their ways of life. Moreover, the massive mobilizations that followed allowed to break the media siege and provided national and international repercussions. The disappearance and the subsequent discovery of Santiago's lifeless body in the Rio Chubut, in a place that had been searched 4 times in the 60 days between the disappearance and the moment they found it, and that was 300 meters upstream, the place where he was last seen while he was pursued by gendarmes, and that allows us to presume that the corpse was planted there after the death, also made visible a historical confrontation in our country, which in recent times has been growing exponentially. The persecution, harassment, and repression of native peoples who claim their ancestral lands usurped by foreign and national landowners can be traced far back in time, but it has become particularly serious in the last 20 years following the boom of extractivism, with fracking and other water-polluting methods, and the introduction of culture techniques that are equally lethal to the environment, such as direct sowing with transgenic seeds and the massive use of pesticides containing glyphosate and dangerous chemicals, the clearing of forests, the destruction of wetlands, and other commons. Thus, the historical repression against indigenous people was joined by attacks against the movements of neighbors, peasants, and entire villages and cities who resist water pollution, fumigations, and defend their lands against foreign and transnational capital. We can track examples as far as 1999, for instance. Since 1980, there was a community, a Mapuche Tehuelche community called Futawau, 550 kilometers away from Esquel in Chubut, in the Patagonia, who have been claiming 2,500 acres that included their community school. It had been usurped by a landowner called Seyd Pesten under the protection of the military during the dictatorship. Despite the 1994 constitutional reform that expressly recognizes the right of indigenous peoples to their historical territories, the struggle continued with various confrontations and also instances of negotiation with unfulfilled promises. Finally, in 1989, fed up with delays, the members of the community cut the fences, entered the premises, recovered the school building, and occupied their ancestral territory. The Justice of Esquel prosecuted 15 members of the community for the crimes of usurpation of their own land and aggravated damage. Between 2001 and 2002, in the heat of the great popular mobilizations that overthrew Presidente Fernando de la Rua's government, the residents of Esquel in Chubut began to organize against an open-pit mining project of the Canadian company Meridian Gold. They created the Assembly No Mine, which with very strong mobilizations and despite repeated threats and attacks to its main reference, achieved a great goal in 2003 when the local area, the local government had to convene a referendum on the acceptance or not of the extractive activity in the area. 82% of the population voted no mine, and the government was forced to declare Esquel a non-toxic and environmentally sustainable city. The Assembly, after this triumph, began to coordinate with movements in other provinces, and the Union of Citizen Assemblies was formed as a space for articulation against extractivism. But the triumph against Meridian Gold did not prevent the area to be plundered by other multinationals, and nowadays it is the center of the conflict with the Mapuche community. And, on the other hand, landowners like British Joe Louis or Italian Luciano Benetton Luis is a personal friend of President Macri. Macri usually goes to his estancia for a short rest, and he is the owner of the Tavistock Economic Group, which occupies more than 2,000 hectares near El Bolsón, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it includes a lake, Lago Escondido, because it's hidden between the mountains and the forest. So people cannot access to the lake anymore because it is within the usurped land. And Benetton and his enterprises own about 95,000 hectares in the whole Argentina, mostly in Patagonia, but also in San Juan and other provinces. At the same time, there have been great struggles throughout the country facing similar initiatives of different transnational industries. The destruction of native forests for the plantation of soybean and other industrial crops, and the obtaining of wood, firewood, and charcoal affects provinces as Chaco, Misiones, Formosa, and Córdoba. The mountain areas are victims of great mining exploits. Pascualama, Gualcamayo, and Veladero in San Juan, La Lumbrera and Agua Rica in Catamarca, Sierra Pintada in Santa Cruz, Cerro Vanguardia in Mendoza, and the list goes on and on. The boom of transgenic cultures dangerously reduces the diversity of products, it encourages clearing, it destroys soils, and contaminates the environment and people with pesticides that cause illnesses and even death, because these chemicals affect hormonal and immune systems. And meanwhile, the companies and the government privilege profit. So each and every one of these struggles, like many others carried out in defense of working people's rights, sooner or later, and much sooner than later, face repression. We saw this, for instance, in the last decade in Gualeguaychú, Entre Rios, where there was an assembly of citizens opposing the construction of an industrial pole to produce cellulose pulp in Fraiventos, in Uruguay, across the Uruguay River. The Gualeguaychú citizens kept the international bridge between Argentina and Uruguay cut off for 4 years, from 2006 to 2010, and continue to denounce air and water pollution by the Finnish company Botnia. Then and now, they have been shot with rubber bullets, they have been gassed by federal forces, and they have been attacked by paramilitary shock groups, and were, of course, criminalized through countless court cases. We can summarize a scenario of permanent combination of two methodologies. On one hand, direct repression through security forces in uniform or paramilitary shock groups, which we call patotas in Argentina, and the word comes from Italy. On the other hand, there is repression through the judiciary system, which criminalizes protest and social conflict. The aim is to impose discipline to all kinds of popular struggles, including, of course, environmental ones. Along with that, coexist the usual practices for social control against the younger, the poorer, the most vulnerable, using tools as trigger-happy police killings, systematic tortures in detention centers, and the nationwide normative that empowers security forces to arbitrarily detain anyone who meets their idea of suspicious or dangerous. However, although we have been systematizing these attacks against the working people for decades, and we have registered more than 5,600 unarmed people killed by state forces in December 1983, and we have documented even more thousands of attacks on fighters all over the country, the fact is that in the last 3 years, since President Mauricio Macri came into office, we face an unprecedented situation in terms of repression. We now have to face a government that openly defends the dictatorship, that speaks of dirty war instead of genocide and state terrorism, that denies our 30,000 desaparecidos, that frees genocides and sends them home. Moreover, it's a government that has recently decided that local and federal security forces are not enough and thus took the necessary steps to introduce the military in so-called internal security affairs. One of the images in the video was when President Macri announced that to the armed forces. The growing attack against any kind of political or social protest comes along with hundreds of persecuted activists, political prisoners, and it has also taken its toll in lives. Just 2 months after the forced disappearance of Santiago Maldonado, in fact, the same day that his family was finally able to mourn him and bury him, members of Prefectura Naval is the force that supposedly guards rivers and other waterways, attacked another Mapuche community, this time in Lago Mascardi, near Bariloche. Young Rafael Nahuel, 22 years old, was shot in the back by the prefects while he was trying to escape to the mountains. You heard Minister of Security Patricia Bullrich on the video saying the day after that shooting, that killing, that execution, we think that the version of the forces, what the prefects say, is the only true version because they said they had been attacked. A curious way to attack with your back to your opponent. Also, after Santiago's disappearance, the government made a very public and strong defense of Gendarmeria, and every time there is a happy trigger killing, they stand up for the police forces. So from the beginning, the very beginning of the Cambiemos administration, we have been alerting about their advance against all our rights and especially against all the forms of protest. The list of official initiatives is very long. Some of them were achieved, others were slowed down thanks to massive public demonstrations and political struggle. I'm not able to tell you about how in this context the judiciary and the public prosecutors have assumed a leading role in repression. You saw some of the images of the demonstrations in September and December last year against the shrinking of retirement, and the cyber patrolling, the espionage systems that have already been passed as law in the city of Buenos Aires and are going to be amplified to the whole country when the National Congress votes the proposed reforms of the Penal Code and the Penal Procedural Code. In the meantime, of course, military Yankee bases are progressive with a mask of humanitarian operations like the Medretes in the Acuífero Guaraní in the northeast or the gas reserves in Vaca Muerta in the south. So far, I have to cut it off. We could talk about widespread torture, about deaths in detention centers, about the whole system that legally provides the resources to detain anybody the police or prefectura or gendarmeria wish to detain, which has been declared against the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, and there is a ruling of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, not the Commission, the court, after a trial, ordering the Argentine state to rule out all this normative. And of course, the recent agreements with the International Monetary Fund that submit our country to looting and have caused monstrous devaluations in less than 3 months and translates into unemployment, inflation, increasing rates, and so on, explain their need to introduce the armed forces in order to control social discontent. This is, of course, just a brief summary of the repressive situation in the Argentine Republic with regard to environmental struggles and all people's struggles. These kind of struggles unite us all over the planet. International active solidarity is a fundamental support to all of us, as it has been expressed here in Salerno in these days. That's why I want to expressly thank the organizers of this workshop for having invited us to share our experience, but mostly to learn from yours. Let us face together in unity all these attempts to plunder our commons and to sacrifice them in the altar of capitalist accumulation. Let us continue mobilized and alert, resisting every advance. In my country, we've learned from Madres de Plaza de Mayo that there is no such thing as a lost struggle as long as you don't give up. So this is my humble conclusion after these rich days of sharing and learning. Do not give up. The working people of the world will prevail.
Thank you.